Human suffering in the past was God or nature's punishment, but today we mainly blame others and ourselves for our misery. We can go through physical and mental abuse by our families, friends, society, and the state. Choose to be in abusive relationships and abuse our bodies by consuming junk food, smoking cigarettes, drinking too much alcohol, and using dangerous drugs out of self-hate, laziness, escapism, the need for comfort, carelessness, or boredom. In the 70s and 80s, independent films in the United States show how survivors of trauma and abuse can become violent and resort to revenge in their quest for justice, as Travis Bickle, the protagonist in Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver, did. But since the 90s, independent films began to shed light on the problem and its symptoms. Films like Happiness by Todd Solondz, Requiem for a Dream by Darren Aronofsky, and Supersize Me by Morgan Spurlock try to show that abuse had been normalized in contemporary society and that change is desperately needed. The longest running show in American television is NBC's Law & Order Special Victims Unit, which focuses on sexual abuse, and in Joker, a new film by Todd Phillips, who was influenced by Taxi Driver, we find along with the protagonist that he was abused and oppressed by his mother, mass media, mass culture, and corrupt politicians, and that he is not the only one. Instead of being a sleeper cell that woke up, the anti-hero in Joker became a leader that awakens the people. In Westworld, an HBO series, even the robots found out that humans abused them and rise up in order to form a new world order. It is normal and encouraged today to speak openly about abuse and trauma, and US culture is haunted by the past more than ever due to this progress. The systematic oppression and abuse of black people, women, and poor people in America became something to reckon with, and no one should get away from punishment. In season 1 of The Sinner, a USA show, a detective investigates a murder case of an innocent man on the beach, killed by a woman who is a mother and wife. We learn that fanatical Christian parents raised her and her sister, who was fatally sick from birth. She and her sister were taught that their bodies are imperfect and source of evil, and ever since she was a young girl, her mother told her that if she will sin or not pray enough to God, her sister will die. But what is good or bad was never clear to her, since she witnessed her father cheating on her mother with a next-door neighbor. Her life and the detective's life don't have a direction, and they cannot love anyone because they both were abused. They try to be good in order to be loved, and only enjoy casual sex and masochism. Eventually we learn that the man she killed had sex with her sister and then killed her by trying to bring her back to life after she fainted. She witnessed it, and later on, when she saw him on the beach, she mistaken the present with the past, a symptom of survivors of trauma. The show is implicitly arguing that trauma and abuse is part of the culture and tradition. Gang leaders and soldiers raped their enemies and their women because they realized it is a way they can control them. Alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, and sugar suppliers can trust their customers to come back for more. Fascist leaders know that there are fewer chances that the people will revolt if they are oppressed. Religious fanatics can control the desires and sinful thoughts by punishing their bodies. Masochistic people want to be controlled and abused in order to relive their traumatic past, since it provides them with some relief, or hurt themselves and seek excessive pleasure in order to gain more control over their lives. Survivors of abuse and trauma act against themselves and their bodies, and instead of telling their story, they follow someone else's story, as films like Chuck and Buck by Miguel Arteta and The Girl on the Train by Tate Taylor illustrate. In the third season of The Sinner, the creators of the show became obsessed with Nietzsche's will to power. Since the scientific revolution, the exercise of power over nature, other human beings, and non-human animals, rather than living according to absolute values, became the norm, as Nietzsche emphasized. The will to power, though, is also positive, since it reminds us to be egoistic, not to be dependent on anything, or to be exposed to harm, but control our situation by overcoming any objection and obstacle. In this way, we can also be unique, not reduced to the herd, as the protagonist of the show tells one of his students, who is not sure whether she should do what her parents and society expects her to do, or choose instead an unknown path. But the creators of the show argue that an excessive use of will to power is not always a sign of strength, but that of loss of self. Most chances are that sociopaths and psychopaths at some point in their lives were abused by society and the people around them, and dealt with it by disassociating from everything. Without noticing it, we all sometimes disassociate from our harsh reality and see it from a distance or from above in order to disconnect from it for some time. But these individuals cannot come back down to earth so easily and quickly like most of us do. They can move beyond good and evil and do harm to others without guilt to break off from the normal and moral because they lost touch with reality. This means that we all have the capability to become sinners, not because we naturally have an evil side, but because we are vulnerable beings and as such could be victims of abuse in one form or another, as Nietzsche himself argued in his writings and experienced in his personal life. If we are not able to overcome our traumas, we could turn out to be predators ourselves, or mistaking justice with retribution, a violent religious eye for an eye revenge, rather than punishment for unjust acts, soft revenge, restoration, rehabilitation, or the attempts to prevent from cases of injustice to happen again by making social and cultural changes. For example, having a more just distribution of wealth, or legislating social programs and more just laws. But why do human beings hurt and treat one another and themselves as objects to be controlled in the first place? One can argue that it is because of the objectification of any aspect of life in modernity. That cannot be the case, though, because it is not a unique modern phenomenon, but became a problem in modernity. In the past, one was chosen to be a part of a religious and traditional way of life, in which any event that happens in her or his lifetime and afterlife is determined. And as a result, in moments of suffering, one could have gotten comfort knowing that it was God's wish or part of the tradition, and as such, inevitable. But most of us in contemporary society cannot live in self-denial. We are aware of our existence, but our birth is not something we chose. Nor did we choose to be in this particular body that can feel pain and necessarily will die on an unknown date, or in this particular time in history and particular culture that we didn't institute. To be alive is to be limited both by nature and culture, and only openness to meaning can expand the possibilities they set for us in order to be able to reshape our future. Under these existential conditions, others abuse us and we abuse ourselves in order to feel superior, since by doing so, instead of being limited and inferior, they and we can set the limits. Moreover, we can take unnecessary risks and put ourselves in danger in order to resist or play with our fate. Que sera sera, whatever will be, is the most efficient attitude, but also the most dangerous way to deal with anxiety. And we can even choose to die the way we want to, before society or nature will make these decisions for us. Even when we sacrifice ourselves for a cause or someone that is close to us, we are basically trying to gain more control over our future and someone else's future. But instead of constantly trying to deal with the inevitable, through purposeful suffering, we can try to be mature and live without a God, a task Nietzsche himself, the worshipper of Dionysus, did not achieve, by taking both the good and the evil as possibilities that the individual and the community at large need to decide to refrain from or adopt. No one chose us, but we can choose ourselves in order to have a meaningful existence. We need to acknowledge the devil inside us and try not to forget that there is a meaning to our shared lives with others, to love, in order to form a healthy and dynamic political body that has power and clear identity.